my first duty is to introduce the President of the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Professor Leslie Regan, who I'm delighted to know is the first female of the college in 1946 years. Well done, congratulations. May I invite you to the podium to come and welcome us, please.
So, Professor Ansari, it's a delight to be here, and of one of the three colleges, as you've already heard, that established the combined Royal Colleges Medal. It's a great honour to welcome you to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and to the 2017 Annual Combined Royal Colleges Lecture. So I'd particularly like to welcome and to congratulate, if I may, Professor Caroline Wilkinson, last year's recipient of the Combined Royal Colleges Medal, and the lady who is delivering tonight's lecture. And I'd also like to welcome and congratulate the winner of this year's medal, Dr. Andrew Bastauras. Now this college is particularly interested and focusing on trying to improve women's health. So I did a little bit of research before I came this evening, and I discovered that the recipient of the award in 2007 was a personal friend and a great friend of this college, Dr. Nancy Durrell McKenna. And her work has undoubtedly improved our understanding of fistula, obstetric fistula that is, reproductive health, and she's highlighted through her work the need for better maternity care for mothers around the world. So thank you for having the good sense to have made her the 2007 recipient a decade ago. So I suppose in an ideal world, we'd be able to diagnose and treat and cure our patients without causing any harmful side effects. But what I recognise, having been a qualified doctor for 37 years now, is that the use of sophisticated medical imaging has enabled doctors to see inside a patient without having to perform any invasive techniques. So I'd like to thank everyone who's dedicated their lives to the development of medical imaging, which has undoubtedly had immense benefits both for patients and doctors and all the other healthcare professionals that we work with. So I'm looking forward very much, Caroline, to listening to what I'm sure will be a fascinating lecture. And I'd like you all to take a few moments as you're leaving the college tonight to look at this extraordinary photography exhibition that we have on display. It's those rather alarming life-size portraits that you will see of some extraordinary women in UK medicine. Many of them are obstetricians and gynecologists because we rather favour those in this college. But I wanted to explain to you that 2017, this is purely coincidence that you chose to come and have your launch here tonight, but in 2017 has been an extraordinary year for women in medicine in the UK. It's the 100th anniversary of the Medical Women's Federation. It's the 150th anniversary of when Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first doctor, a female doctor, to qualify in medicine. And as a tribute to those extraordinary historical moments, the Royal College of Physicians have launched a photography exhibition. And if you have a few moments, just go across the park, the other side of the park, to the RCP in St Andrew's Place, and you'll see this amazing exhibition of many, many women in medicine. You will notice that all of the women in posters that we have here, they're copies from the exhibition across the park, they're all holding a framed photograph. And every woman who was asked to contribute to the exhibition was asked to bring with her a photograph of a woman who had inspired her. And you will see the captions. I'm going to leave you at that point, but thank you again for coming this evening, and I'm sure that we're going to have a fabulous evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Regan. My next task is to introduce the President of the Royal Photographic Society, Robert Albright, Honorary Fellow of the Royal Photographic Society. Having served his time on the council, he was elected a vice president, and after vice presidency, he was duly elected in September as the president of the Royal Photographic Society, unopposed. He is an accomplished photographer in his own right, in the sense that he achieved his distinction of fellowship in audiovisual photography by proper application, where he was assessed by his peers and found to be suitable candidate for fellowship. He was a regional organizer for Western Region from 2002 to 2009. Robert read law at Oxford University, now retired, but his professional life, he worked in contract negotiation at Hawker Sidney Aviation, Twin Lock, Ford Motor Company, and Royal Mail. No doubt his contract negotiation skills will be very helpful to the society. And his interest is also in literature, music, art, and film. And I mustn't forget to mention, he has a terrier called Archie. Thank you. Robert, would you like to come up, please, and introduce the speaker?
Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege this evening to introduce Professor Caroline Wilkinson. Caroline is director of the Facelab and of the Liverpool School of Art and Design. She has a background in art and science, and her research and creative work sits at the forefront of art-science fusion, something that we share with you in the Royal Photographic Society. And her work includes subjects as diverse as forensic art, human anatomy, medical art, face recognition, forensic science, anthropology, 3D visualization, digital art, and craniofacial identification. So that's a Renaissance woman, if ever there was one. Caroline is a graduate of the University of Manchester, where she also led the unit of art in medicine between 2000 and 2005, and received a Nestor Fellowship to develop a 3D computerized facial reconstruction system for use in forensic and archaeological depiction. She moved to the Liverpool Medical Unit from the University of Dundee, where she was head of human identification in the award-winning Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification. Her high-profile facial depiction work includes facial depictions of Richard III, St. Nicholas, Johann Sebastian Bach, Ramesses II, and Mary, Queen of Scots. I'm particularly interested in the Richard III reconstruction. I don't know if you're going to cover that here this evening, because I did follow that on Channel 4 when it was a very hot topic in the press and on television. And I know there are members of the Richard III Society here this evening who were quite closely involved in that project. The Facelab research relates to facial identification, post-mortem decomposition, ancestry determination, preserved bodies, and facial animation. Caroline received the Combined Royal Colleges Medal in 2016, last year. Professor Caroline Wilkinson.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you very much for coming out on a Friday evening to listen to me. Oh, it's Thursday, you're right. It's been a very confusing week. I've been away 2 days. I don't know if I'm coming or going. Yes, on a Thursday evening. So I thought that I would give you a little bit of background about the work that I do in relation to both images of the living and images of the dead, which is what the work that I'm involved in at Facelab. I'll also show you some examples. I can't, for obvious reasons, show you examples of forensic casework, but I have plenty of archaeological reconstruction work that I can illustrate throughout the presentation. So I will be talking about Richard III. I will also be talking about Robert the Bruce reconstruction and some other examples as well. But I'm going to start by showing you some of the work that we've been doing looking at average faces. But first of all, I thought I would introduce my team, because nothing that I do on my own. I have a very well-rounded group in Facelab in Liverpool from very varied backgrounds. So the people that work in the team come from either art, photography, illustration, fine art backgrounds, or they come from anatomy, dentistry, anthropology backgrounds. And everybody within the team ends up learning those subject areas that they haven't qualified in, so everyone becomes fully rounded in both art and science subjects. And we often have, as we have with Maria, a visiting research fellow, in this case from the Canaries, and we're doing a project on some ancient Canarian faces as well. So as you've heard, the work that we do within the Facelab research group covers lots of different subject areas. It's very interdisciplinary. We often work a lot with other collaborators from across the university and external to the university. So you can see the subject areas that have been read out already in relation to our collaborations. But everything that we do, as the name suggests, is related to faces. Everything in relation to faces and identity and identification. And the reason that our research is built around that face focus is because the face is so important to us in terms of our identity and in terms of our identification. So when you meet somebody for the first time, if you can see them, before you speak to them, their face gives you lots of information about who they are. So you get a very immediate piece of information about their biological profile. You can tell very quickly whether someone is male or female. We can tell pretty quickly a rough age of somebody by looking at their face. We might get an indication of their ethnic group, of their origins by looking at their face. Depending on how they choose to present their face to us, we may get an indication of their personality, perhaps of their culture. We may get an indication of their health status from looking at their face. So the face is incredibly important. It's so important, and we're so good at distinguishing between people by looking at their faces, that we use it every day for authentication of our identity and verification of who we are. So we use it on identity cards, on passports, on the type of cards you have for going in and out of workplaces. And we take photographs of people when they're arrested or when they're convicted of a crime. And we use facial photographs now within our computer systems for identifying all the people in our photographs and all the people that we have on our records. So the face is incredibly important in terms of identification and therefore in terms of identity. Within the Facelab work and within identification of faces, we use a lot of imaging types, both 2D and 3D. So we use a lot of clinical images, CT, MRI, X-rays, ultrasound. All of this information is used within the processes that we've developed. We frequently use CT data now of skeletal remains that we can take into our 3D digital computer system so that we're working with 3D images in the computer as well as in the real world. And now we have fantastic scanners. I don't know if any of you have seen 3D scanners now and the quality that you can get from those. Expensive ones produce amazing quality, but even cheap ones now are producing very quick and reasonable ways of collecting 3D information. And of course, we can also 3D print any of the information that we're collecting as well, whether that's something we've collected through a scan or whether we produced it in the computer and then printed it out. And we do that a lot with many of the depictions. We'll produce a 3D printed head that then can be exhibited in a museum, which is exactly what happened with Richard III. So the areas that I work in relate to faces of the living, in terms of recognition issues, identity issues, and how our faces change throughout our lifetime. And then also in relation to faces of the dead for identification purposes in forensic investigations, and also for depicting people from the past within archaeological investigation. So I'll start with some of the faces of the living work. I am going to give you some questions to answer as we go along as well, just to keep you awake if you've had a couple of glasses of wine. A little bit of interaction is no bad thing. I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Francis Galton. He was a very prolific scientist from the Victorian period, and much of his work has been discredited, or many of his theories have been discredited, not least his theory of eugenics. He became very focused for a while on the use of photography. And one of the things that he developed was the idea of a composite photograph, where you take a number of images of faces of individuals superimpose them to create an average of those faces. And he was doing this as a way of trying to find the criminal type. He was obsessed with being able to predict characteristics of personality and occupation by looking at faces. He spectacularly failed to do that, but he spent a lot of time creating these composite portraits to try and identify criminality or disease or occupation. He did concede that these average faces that he created, instead of highlighting criminality, in fact highlighted humanity. And the average that developed was a much more pleasing and considered beautiful face than any of the single faces it was made from. Whilst much of his work, as I've said, has been discredited, one of the things he did establish was how many faces you need to produce an average, which unbelievably to most of us is only 20. So any 20 faces from any demographic and any other 20 faces will produce the same average. There's been a resurgence of studies of average faces recently, which is why we moved into this kind of little area of research. A recent piece of research came out of Stanford University claiming to identify whether or not you're gay from a single photograph of a face. And there are a lot of new companies that are developing who claim to be able to take facial photographs and give personality readings or identify if someone is likely to be a criminal or a terrorist or a paedophile. These are genuine and in some cases based on some research, products that are now available and out there for use. So I thought just last night, I went online because there are many of these free online services you can do where you can input a facial photograph of yourself and it will tell you what kind of personality you are just from that single photograph. So I thought I'd do that and share that with you. This is what it said about me. So, first of all, I'm not very focused. Despite the fact I've been working in the same field for 30 years, I'm clearly not very focused. I don't like change, despite the fact I've lived in 5 different cities and quite like moving from anatomy into art and back again. It's nice that they told me I'm truly talented and gifted, but, then I won't be very lucky in love, despite the fact I've been with the same man for 35 years. I like beautiful things around me. Well, that's true, but then who doesn't? So that's easy to say. I'm intelligent, truthful, decisive and determined. That's lovely, but let's wait till later and I'll show you how useful that is. I'm not into clothes or appearance is a little harsh from that photograph, I think. And I can be moody. Well, I'm a woman. All women can be moody. That's fine. And the last one made my family nearly cry with laughter. So we'll just move on. I just wanted to share this with you as a not very accurate way that we all have cognitive bias in relation to faces. Whether we like it or not, when we meet someone, we tend to give them or assume that they have certain qualities through our own cognitive bias. And this is an extreme example of that. It's a little bit like astronomy in that people like being told these kind of things. So being able to put your face in and be told that you're lovely is what people like to hear, or to be given certain character traits. But the fact that this is becoming a big area of scientific research again, from something that was really developed in the 18th century and discredited in the 19th century is very strange. But because of the resurgence of this use of average faces, we thought we would do a similar study. This is another site that just profiling what they claim to be able to predict from a facial photograph. So we did a study. We were trying to look at cognitive bias within a population in relation to local demographics and also in relation to occupation and personality traits, and putting it in the context of what's considered at the moment the crisis of identity in the UK, with the post-Brexit referendum and fears of immigration. It was based around that. So we created an exhibition called Faces of Merseyside, and we collected faces, either donated faces or faces that we took from internet sources from across Merseyside. And part of this was for an exhibition within Liverpool. These are the average faces of male and female adult Merseysiders and male and female children from Merseyside, which was where we started out. But then we thought we would split it down and start to look at occupations within those groups and see whether or not, when people viewed this exhibition, what their responses to the exhibition would be. So we broke down, these are the average faces again in relation to occupation, so the average police officers. What I like about the police officers is you get this ghosting of their hats, which I quite like on the top there. Academics from the universities in Liverpool and GPs, mostly in the doctors column there. I mean, effectively, they're the same faces with small differences between them. We also broke down academics into subject areas. So we looked at academics in the creative, art and science worlds. We looked at engineering, business, law, health and nursing. These are effectively pictures of the same people from slightly different views with different clothing. We get the same averages, more or less, of those faces with some small differences. And then we also looked at slightly different populations, and all of these were the numbers within the averages were based on population demographics, as well as through the donated faces. So we looked at students in Liverpool, celebrities, mostly actors and actresses. We looked at footballers, professional footballers, from, in this case, Liverpool Football Club. We looked at MPs. We could only do males, there weren't enough women to include in an average. Nurses, and then Liverpool Echo fantastically published pictures of everybody convicted of a crime once a month, so we could download those for the average faces of Merseyside criminals as well. And then there was lots more that we had, and we exhibited them within the art school, and we surveyed people in terms of their responses. Interestingly, the main response was that people were surprised that they weren't more different. But when you asked them if they thought occupation was linked to facial appearance, they said no, but then they were surprised that there weren't any more differences. So, which suggests that cognitive bias in some way, that even though we know logically that occupation cannot be linked to facial appearance, we also believe inside that artists look different to scientists and technologists look different to lawyers. And when it's clearly shown that's not the case, that created a discrepancy in how people felt about the exhibition. Now, there were differences. Of course, these don't tell you about facial appearance being linked to occupation. What they tell you about are the demographics of the faces that are in there. So Liverpool Football Club recruit footballers from around the world. Therefore, they have a different demographic to people who are working as nurses within Merseyside. That's all that shows you. But people responded to these differences in a way that suggests they wanted to believe that facial appearance was linked to the occupation of an individual. So we are still very tied up in the beliefs that we have in terms of cognitive bias in terms of facial appearance. And then, of course, we do lots of work in relation to Faces of the Dead. That's just one small example of some of the work that we do with the living. But the majority of the work that we're involved in within Facelab is related to depicting faces of people from the past or people for forensic investigation. In terms of forensic investigation, we only tend to get involved when there's very little clues for the police to go on. The police are pretty good at identifying bodies. So for us to be involved, there really has to be no clues for them to follow. And the methods that we use to depict a face it's really a tool for recognition. It's never used for identification purposes. It's a way of getting names, and then the police will identify the bodies through DNA or dental assessment, the usual ways that people are identified. And we tend to be involved sometimes when there are many bodies and it's not possible to use DNA or dental records, because then it's not an appropriate form, either because they're not available or there are too many bodies. In a mass disaster, for example, and then craniofacial identification might be a good way of filtering and getting names for identification. The method we use now is pretty much 100% digital. It's come from a traditional manual method of building clay directly onto a cast of a skull. But now with our ability to collect 3D data and use digital format, we've developed this 3D digital way that's much more, is non-invasive and is much less damaging or potentially damaging to the remains. This system that was developed for facial reconstruction, as was mentioned, was developed under a Nesta Fellowship when I was at the University of Manchester. The system has a 3D digital environment. It has a haptic feedback system, which is a bit difficult to explain, but it means that I can feel what I'm looking at in the computer. So this arm that you can see here, you hold a pen at the end of the arm, and as you move it, it kind of mirrors the movements of your arm and gives you feedback as to what you're touching in the computer screen. So I've never been in the same room as the remains of Richard III, but I've still touched his skull through the use of our haptic system, because we can feel the skull within the 3D digital world. And this is the methodology. We have a database of pre-modelled muscles. We import them to the skull and then alter them to fit each skull. We then use tissue depth pegs that tell us about the average set of soft tissues over and above the muscle structure, and that's related to age and sex and ethnic group. And then we have complicated CGI methods that are now used to texture our finished heads. These are the tissue depth pegs that you can see on the surface of the skull that tell us about the average depth at that point, dependent on the sex, age and ethnic group of the individual. And there are hundreds of these. This is by no means all of them, but it gives you an indication of the types of data that we work with in relation to tissue depth. So what we do is we get a skull, we choose the most appropriate set of data from the hundreds of sets that we have, and then we use that in the reconstruction. And then we model the muscle structure. So all of us, more or less, have the same muscles with the same origins and attachment, but because the skull is a different shape and proportions for each of us, modelling exactly the same muscles onto those skulls will give you 3 different face shapes and proportions, which is what you can see here. 3 different skulls, 3 different faces and proportions that have developed from that modelling. Within that, we then predict facial features through assessment of particular areas of the bone that are related to those features. So we look at the orbits and the depth of the orbits to tell us about the prominence and position of the eyeballs based on MR data. We use dental data for predicting the lip shape and position from the teeth. We take those measurements from the nasal aperture to predict the shape, the prominence, the position of the nostrils of the nose. And we look at the mastoid processes on the base of the skull to tell us about the ears. We don't know very much about ears. They're probably our least accurate feature now. We know whether someone has earlobes or not based on those mastoid processes and the direction that they point. But that tends to be it. Most of the other details of the ears we're uncertain of from the skull. Most of us have got earlobes like this, where it goes up before it hits the side of the head. A small number, probably about 10% of us in a white European population, have adherent ears, where the ear doesn't go up before it hits the side of the head. So there's probably a handful of people here who've got adherent ears if it's 10%. There's one up there. Any others? 2, yeah, we've got a couple, 3, there we go, that's about the right percentage. And they're hereditary features, so most of us tend to have the same on left and right, although this is the same person. He has one lobe and one adherent here, as does my daughter, actually. She's also got one of each, so it does happen, but mostly we're symmetrical with earlobes. But otherwise, we don't know very much about ears. We tend to use standard ears that we just vary the size and the lobe shaping. So this is a full reconstruction developing. You can see the eyeballs in place, the tissue depth pegs, the muscle structure from pre-modelled muscles, positioning of those features based on prediction standards, and then a skin layer placed over the top of that to give the finished face. And this is one of those studies produced by Wonjun Lee, who was one of my PhD students at the time. And he used Korean data from the dental hospital in Korea. He produced reconstructions and then compared them directly with the 3D face of the actual individual from the CT scan, and also photographs that were taken of them at the time when they had the CT scans carried out. We can also measure exactly how accurate we are. So we have a 3D model of a depiction that's been produced with the skull inside, and we have a 3D scan of the actual person with the skull inside. So what we've been able to do is to superimpose, using the skull as a way of matching up, superimpose the two 3D faces and measure exactly where the differences are between the depiction and the actual face. And that's what this is showing you. So this is a contour map. Anything that's blue is the area of least error, and anywhere that's a red or orange is the area of most error. So what you can see here is the head injury this person had, which is why we had the CT data from this individual. And we've repeated this a number of times, and what our results show is that 70% of the surface of the facial reconstruction has less than 2 millimeters of error. So we know exactly how accurate we are in being able to predict shape. And we're pretty confident now in our ability to predict the shape of a face from the 3D assessment of the shape of the skull. So at this stage, I'm pretty confident this shape is going to be recognisable as the individual to whom the skull belonged. It's now possible for us to wrap very complicated textures around that 3D structure to make the head look as realistic as possible. We can put skin textures, eye textures, hair textures, wrinkles, moles, blemishes, you name it, we can add it and we can make it look as realistic and living as possible. The problem for us in a forensic investigation is anything from this point onwards is guessing. And we have no idea of the skin colour, the eye colour, the hairstyle, the number of wrinkles that someone has, etc., from skeletal assessment. So there's an argument in a forensic case that we shouldn't put this information on unless we're certain of it, because if we get it wrong, then it might be confusing for recognition. So this is a friend of mine. He's an academic from the university in Edinburgh. He looks like neither of these pictures in reality. He got a makeup artist to give him different wigs, different facial hair wigs, different glasses, and had his photograph taken a number of different ways for a face recognition study he was doing. There are no prosthetics involved here, so the shape of his face is exactly the same in both of those images. But if you knew him with the beard and glasses, and the reconstruction was produced with the curly wig, then that might be enough to confuse recognition and mean that the person doesn't get identified. So again, there's an argument for us not putting texture on at all and just putting a 3D shape out in the hope that people will recognise that. But what we also know is it's quite difficult to recognise somebody from just 3D shape. Does anybody know who this is? This is somebody you all know. Sorry? Nice. No, it's not. Anybody? It's me. So this is a 3D scan of my face. Tutankhamun is great. No one's ever said that before. I did once talk to Dundee Rotary Club, and I put this image up and said, who is it? A gentleman at the front woke up and said, oh, is it President Obama? Which is the best one yet, but Tutankhamun is not bad. I like that. No, it's me. And this was done when I was maybe in my 30s, I think this 3D scan was taken. I showed this to my daughter when she was 12, and she didn't recognise this as me, despite having known me all her life. So it is very difficult to recognise somebody from just 3D shape, unless they've got quite a characteristic face, and then it's easier to recognise from shape. So in a forensic investigation, typically, the image will look like this. It'll be black and white because we're not indicating any colour information that we don't know. We tend to focus on the part of the face that we're certain of, or more certain of in terms of detail. So the centre of the face, where the features are, will blur out everything externally where we're not certain, like hairstyle. We have found that if you don't put hair on them, people think you're indicating the person was bald. So sometimes we have to put hair there, but then to blur it so it's not clear what colour or style it is. And with men, we cut the top of the head off because we know that that doesn't make any difference to recognition, but it means that we don't have to guess whether or not they've gone bald. So that helps us a great deal. Within archaeology and historical depictions, we have, I guess, what you'd call more artistic license. We're not trying to show exactly what that person looked like to enable an identification. We're trying to show the most likely appearance of that person based on all the evidence. So we'll often work with the archaeologists or the Egyptologists or the historians who will give us an indication of the most likely hairstyle, the most likely clothing, the most likely skin colour, eye colour for somebody from that part of the world, from that period of time, with that status. And that's what we tend to work on. And sometimes we get more information about that than other times, if there's portrait information, for example, or written information. I'll just show you a few examples of that, even with the advice of archaeologists and historians, and even with portrait information, this can still be a controversial subject in relation to how we choose those colours and textures. So this is a reconstruction that we did of Johann Sebastian Bach some time ago when I was at the University of Dundee. And this was produced for the Bachhaus Museum in Eisenach. We produced the 3D shape from a replica skull that is housed in the museum. And the amount of fatness on the face was taken from portrait information of him, which all showed that he was quite heavy of build. And then Janice Aiken, who was the animator who carried out the texturing, took the colours of the skin, the eyes, the eyebrows, etc., directly from one portrait called the Haussmann portrait. And the reason we use that is because we know that it's recorded that he sat in front of the painter when this painting was produced. So most likely to be more accurate in terms of those colours and textures. Of course, we have no idea what's going on underneath that wig, and he's always presented in a wig in the portraits. And we didn't want to produce a wig for this particular depiction. So the hair is probably the least accurate bit of this depiction. We don't know if he had hair and indeed what colour it would be, or if he was bald. Certainly if he had hair, he would have kept it short like this because wearing wigs was a terribly hot affair, apparently. But that's the least accurate part of the depiction. This was an article in The Guardian that hated the facial reconstruction of Bach, hated the fact it had been done, let alone what it looked like, but then described it as being having something of the Motherwell boozer about him, because at the time I was working in Scotland, therefore I was going to make him look Scottish. So it's always controversial. I also had letters from white supremacist groups in Germany who said I'd made him look less white than he should have been as well, so you can't please everyone. And on that point, this is another good example of a controversial texture. This is St. Nicholas. The remains of St. Nicholas are housed in the cathedral in Bari. There is some debate over whether it's him, but let's assume it is. He was a 3rd, 4th century bishop from ancient Greece, which is now Turkey. And in the 11th century, some Italian sailors stole him from Turkey and took him to Bari, and they won't give him back, and he's in the cathedral. Now, he's in a sarcophagus. He's never moved, but in the 50s they moved him, and when they moved him, a big anthropology assessment was carried out of the remains. Lots of photographs were taken, hundreds of craniometrics, measurements of the skull were taken, and some x-rays were taken as well. So that enabled us to be able to produce a 3D model of his skull from that 2D information, x-rays, photographs, and craniometrics. And then we could produce a facial depiction. The most interesting thing about St. Nicholas is that he had a severely broken nose, at least twice, and healed. He was recorded as getting into lots of fights with other bishops, but he may have just walked into a wall a couple of times as well, so we don't know how that happened, but he had a severely broken nose. We worked with a company called Image Foundry Studios who did the CGI for St. Nicholas, and this was the textures that they gave him. And then a television company got hold of it and gave him a big white beard and made him look like Santa. And then, interestingly, sometime later, Megyn Kelly on Fox News made some slightly unprepared statement, I think, about how Santa was definitely white, as was Jesus. And she got slammed for it, obviously, and our reconstruction featured on The Daily Show because as an example of how clearly he wasn't white, which is somewhat erroneous, but never mind, I quite liked it as a story. We updated St. Nicholas recently because there was some Turkish data that we could use, and we have much better CGI techniques than we did then, which was some time ago now. And we used some of the iconic images of saints, not contemporary to them, but gave some example of typical hairstyles and clothing as well. So he's had a number of iterations, St. Nicholas. They actually did make a television programme on Channel 4 or 5, I think, and showed this. My daughter was really little, and she was sitting playing whilst I was watching it on the television, and she just looked up, and I just had a moment of, oh my God, Santa. So I quickly turned it off, in case you realised that Santa was dead. Sorry to break it to you, if anybody didn't know that already. Obviously, within archaeology, we can use depictions to affect public opinion. And there's no better example of that, I think, than Richard III. I'm sure you're all aware, some more than others in the audience, of the Richard III investigation, where the remains of this English king were found in what's now a car park, or not anymore, it isn't, but at the time was a car park in Leicester. And we were asked to produce a facial depiction of those remains. At the time, actually, he hadn't been positively identified as Richard III. There was lots of evidence to suggest it was him, but it hadn't been confirmed through DNA when we produced the facial depiction. There aren't very many descriptions of Richard III that are recorded in relation to people who actually met him. These are some of those that are recorded by people who actually met him. Most of which describe him as being somewhat slender. There is a description of him having one shoulder higher than the other, although there's disagreement as to which way it is. So there are some descriptions of him as being born with teeth and with hair on his shoulders. And then there seems to be some agreement that although he was quite handsome, he wasn't as handsome as his brother. That seems to be the general description. But that's all we know, really, in relation to people who actually met him and described him. And we worked from CT data and extremely good photographs that were taken by the osteologists of the remains for any detail. At the risk of upsetting the people from Richard III Society, there's nothing really remarkable about Richard III's face. And that, in a sense, is interesting. He's got quite a prominent chin, he's got normal dental occlusion, he's quite what you would describe as gracile. He still looks very male, but on a scale of maleness, he's closer to Justin Bieber than Wayne Rooney. This is the 3D shape of his face that was created in the 3D system. This is just the colour of the clay that we use. It could be any colour. We just happen to use this because it works quite well in terms of lighting. This was then 3D printed. We used prosthetic eyes and painted the head, and a wig and hair was implanted for the eyebrows as well. I work with Janice Aiken, who is the artist from the University of Dundee, who painted up this head and put the clothing and wig in place. At this stage, he had been identified through DNA. The details were taken from the portrait in relation to skin colour, eye colour, hair colour and clothing, those portraits. Since then, however, the University of Leicester has done further DNA analysis, and the results came back that he had lighter hair and eyes than the portraits suggested, which is also interesting and maybe part of the propaganda of the paintings. So a new iteration was produced, exactly the same head, we used exactly the same physical head, we just changed the wig and the eyebrow hair and the eyes for lighter colours, and that's how he looks now in the Richard III Visitor Centre. We've also worked with preserved bodies, Egyptian mummies, bog bodies, sometimes shrunken heads. One of my PhD students did his whole project on shrunken heads. But I won't talk about any of those examples. The example at the top there is Ramesses II, his mummified remains and the depiction. We can also look at people from the past in relation to signs of disease and trauma, looking at lifestyle and custom. It might give us an indication of their origins and ancestry. And then finally, last example is in relation to disease and trauma. We can look at signs of healed trauma that we might need to depict to show how that person looked towards the end of their life. We don't do wounds that cause death, because that would be inappropriate. But if someone has a wound and it's healed and it's changed their facial appearance, then it's wholly appropriate for us to produce that. And these are some of those examples. We've got a knight from Scotland who had a healed, probably sword wound to his forehead. This is a medieval teenager from London who had tertiary syphilis. And this is a soldier from the Battle of Towton who had a healed, at least 10-year-old healed sword wound to the side of his jaw. A good example that I'm going to end on is Robert the Bruce, because this is also a historical figure and somewhat changed the way we viewed him as a historical figure, but more importantly, in this case, shows some signs of disease or possible signs of disease that were used in the depiction. Robert II of Scotland is again not described, and there are no portraits of him, contemporary portraits of him, and no descriptions apart from this one by a very elderly lady who met him when she was a young girl, who managed to say he was beautiful, but we don't really know what that means. So there are no other recorded remarks about his facial appearance, and none of the first portraits were done many hundreds of years after he died. The remains of Robert the Bruce, and again it's controversial as to whether they are the remains of Robert the Bruce, but we'll assume in this case that they are, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are, were discovered in the 1817-18 when Dunfermline Abbey was renovated and a grave was found. I won't go into the details of why they think it was Robert the Bruce, but there are a number of reasons why they thought it was. And an assessment was carried out by a number of prominent anatomists and pathologists of the remains and the skull. A cast was taken of the skull, and there's a number of those that are housed in museums around Scotland. The one in the the one in the Anatomical Museum in Edinburgh is probably the first cast, the primary cast that was made, and the others are copies of that cast, likely, or second casts out of the same mould. So these are photographs of that first cast. And there are some disputed changes to the skull, primarily around the mouth and the nose. So you can see a loss of teeth and a loss of alveolar bone on the maxilla. We've got a loss of nasal bones as well. And this has been disputed as to whether or not these are signs of leprosy. there's big disagreement over this. Certainly he was described by people as having had leprosy at the time, but always his enemies who described him that way. And many Scottish historians think that if he did have leprosy, it would have had a really negative effect on his ability to be a king and to have power. So they don't believe that he had leprosy at all. However, a number of assessments have been carried out of the skull, including assessments by people who are experts in leprosy in medieval skulls, and they think that the signs on this skull are wholly consistent with signs of leprosy. And I would tend to agree, having looked at the cast, that it does look like typical leprosy signs. We will never know for certain because we don't have the actual skull to look at, and it's only a cast. But we decided to do two versions of Robert the Bruce, one with leprosy and one without leprosy, so that we could show more than one variation. This is a 3D shape, and then Mark Ruffley, who I work with now, who does the CGI techniques in Facelab, is extremely clever. He wraps very complicated skin textures around the shape. He builds hair. He worked with experts in warfare, it's probably the wrong term, who told him the typical helmets and clothing that he would have worn from this period of time. This is the reconstruction of Robert the Bruce without leprosy. It's very complicated. So this is the face of Robert the Bruce with that mild signs of leprosy. And then finally with the helmet and chainmail that was suggested by the weaponry experts. So just to end, I put that face of Robert the Bruce through that face personality test software online just to see what it would say about him. This is what it said. He's easygoing and will put up with just about anything. Strong opinions and beliefs, I think we can agree on that. He had problems finding an ideal partner, but they said the same of me, so I think they're just quite biased. And look, they use the same line of intelligence, truthful, decisive and determined. So I've got something in common with Robert the Bruce anyway. And that he has a strong sense of individuality, but is well admired, so take that as you will. Finally, to end on, I thought I would show you what we're doing now in the future. So we're moving into 4D and animation. It's now possible with 4D scanners to capture shape and texture as well as movement. So this is a 4D capture of a colleague of mine, Chris Rowland from the University of Dundee, and you'll see the final one is the textured version of that. So we can capture movement and shape and texture. Isn't that incredible? So now what we're trying to do is to map movement onto some of our historical heads. Right now, we're doing this with Robert Burns. So we've got a Scots poet to read a very short Burns poem, captured that, and then mapped his voice and movements onto the head of Robert Burns so that we can see him reciting one of his own poems. Watch out for that on Burns Night in January. And we hope to be able to do this with other historical figures, like Richard III, for example, reading one of his own speeches, or Ramesses II, or whoever. But that's what we're hoping to do in the future. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Caroline, I'll thank you in due course, but first of all, you have to answer the questions and comments. I'm sure it's so interesting. There will be many questions and many comments. I will take the questions in orderly manner. Please show your hand and you get your turn to have a question answered. Any questions?
That was very interesting. When was the last time you actually had a reproductive skull and clay in your hand? because that's how you started. I remember following your career with endless programs on Time Team and cold cases and all that sort of stuff. And there you were in your lab with your reconstructed skull plaster cast, and you were putting on the clay. So when was the last time? When did you actually stop doing all that bit?
Well, we developed the digital system probably 10 years ago, so more than that, 17 years ago was when I started with it. And obviously things have developed much faster recently with digital technology. Now, I'd say now we barely do a case in the manual method, but we still teach it that way. So it's the best way of learning to do it as a student, because the haptic system has a bit of a steep learning curve. It's a little bit like learning to drive, so it seems really difficult when you first start. So we start them with clay and a cast of a skull, so they learn the process before they have to learn the difficult digital. So all our students do it. So I still do it with teaching, just not so much in casework anymore.
Caroline, I thought that was absolutely fabulous. I'm a
you.
silent witness addict. Have you had any input into silent witness? Because the stuff they do, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, many years ago, when I was working with Richard Neve, in fact, at Manchester, we did some work for one of their programmes, and it wasn't strictly speaking a reconstruction in that we did a sculpture of the actress, and then they used it as a reconstruction in their programme. But we did kind of consult with them on the process as well. That was a long time ago, though.
Yeah, a beautiful lecture. I enjoyed that very much. Innovative and a novel technology and leading us to the future. My background is not only OBGYN, but genetics, so naturally I'm a bit defensive of Galton. He did overreach at times, but of course he didn't know Mendelism, and he didn't know that we had 6 billion base pairs to look at. So my question, to which you alluded to some extent, is how much more powerful could your technology be if you were concomitantly incorporating modern genetics? After all, what 23andMe uses in terms of single nucleotide polymorphisms to tell us whether we're Italian or German or Swedish is limited in number. And one would think that he or she could be able to incorporate that on top of your 3 or 4D morphology and have an even more powerful technology. So what are your thoughts about this, and what are your plans about that?
So we do often use genetic analysis within the work that we do. I mean, it's possible for it to be used within forensic investigation, as in determining maybe ancestry and skin colour and eye colour and hair colour. But it never is, in my experience, because it's too expensive and the police don't go down that route. That may happen in the future, though, and I'm sure that will happen in the future. We do use it within archaeological cases when they're able to collect DNA and stable isotopes. But I think probably what you're referring to is the phenotype-genotype studies that are being carried out linking facial features to genetic components. And there's quite a lot of research that's going on in that field at the moment, and there are some companies that are used in forensic investigation. They tend to produce a more of a biological type than this is what the person looked like. And certainly I think there's a lot of potential for us to work together to be able to produce something that's more accurate. I do think, though, in 10 years' time, that will be how it's all done. I don't think this has longevity in terms of depicting from skeletal remains. It will all be genetic components, but we're not quite there yet. It's the phenotyping bit that's the difficult bit. I think they've conquered the genotype analysis. It's pinning it down to facial features and facial types that's the problem.
Caroline, you used the term average face in your lecture quite a few times.
Yeah.
What is the average face, and how does it compare a Caucasian to a non-Caucasian?
Oh, well, there's plenty of studies that have done that have looked at people from different parts of the world and different ancestry groups and compared average faces. And there's a lot of crossover, if truth be known, between those groups. And what the averaging software does is it gets rid of all the differences and only highlights the things that are common between those faces. So what it doesn't give you is a typical face, it gives you an average, which is somewhat bland and beautiful and symmetrical. So I'm not sure that it's the best way of comparing faces to do the averaging. It's just the best way of illustrating something very common.
Michael? Sorry.
It's okay.
Thanks. I know you mentioned the word accuracy a number of times. It doesn't necessarily matter how accurate something is, as long as you know how accurate it is.
True.
You used a number of photographs. A photograph made by a lens is rarely, if ever, a true replication of the original.
Yeah.
Can you take this into account?
Well, when we compare, when we're looking at an accuracy of comparing, the best thing for us really is to have 3D shape rather than a photograph. And the studies that we've done comparing just 3D shape and getting rid of the texture actually give us much more positive results than the ones with texture from photographs, which I think is interesting. That tells you something about photographs and how they work and how we recognise from them. So ideally, for me, I think we would need to do both. We would need to do 3D shape alongside photographs to get anywhere near the level of accuracy that we would like. And it doesn't matter, you're right, especially if it leads to an identification. It doesn't matter how accurate it is, but it does to me. We want them to be as accurate and reliable as possible, and I'd like to be able to produce exactly the face of that individual. We're nowhere near doing that yet, but it'd be nice to be able to aim for that still.
Michael, in the front row here, please.
Thank you very much. Completely changing the tone of the questions. How accurate and secure is my daughter's new iPhone X? And will you be owning one?
I have no idea. I think that there's, in terms of the face recognition software you mean for getting in, well, I think it's pretty good. I mean, the big computer giants like Google and Apple, etc., have access to millions of people's facial data. They actually have much more access to data than academics do, because they're not bound by the same ethical approval that academics are. So, and everybody who goes on Facebook or Google or whatever is giving them their photographs to use for their research. So their face recognition software is actually excellent. I would be more concerned about the apps that are in the phone than the phone itself, because many of the apps we sign away all of our rights and allow them to record us and watch us, and that's more worrying than the face recognition software, I think.
Sorry, you wanted to ask a question?
That was my question.
Okay.
But related to that, it's possible to buy data from 23andMe for studies that can be used for genetic testing.
Yeah.
You know, my organization recently funded the New England Journal paper that showed there were 6 new genes associated with preterm birth. Those data were obtained because women provided information about their gestational lengths.
Yeah.
In addition to the steps that were used to determine their ancestry.
Yeah.
So you could put 2 and 2 together, as Jack was implying, with the morphology pretty easily.
You can only do that if you have good facial data, though. And 23andMe don't collect facial data, they collect DNA. So we've got nothing to link that to. That's the problem, is getting the optimal data for the kind of testing that we need to do to evaluate that. Yeah.
Sammy?
No, it was just about Richard Need that I was going to mention. I think Marion did a good job of it.
Sorry, may I ask you, Caroline, I remember Richard Neve's work as well, which was predominantly based on manual work rather than on digitized images and computer. So
Yeah.
This is a very great diversification from what Richard did. But Richard was the originator of facial identification.
He was, yeah. And
Yes.
many of the
But
methods.
he didn't use the computers and digitized images, did he?
No, I started with the computer work around the time that Richard retired from the university. But obviously the methodology that he produced, many of those standards we still do use.
Any other question or comments? Yes, there.
I'd like to say, Caroline, I'm a layman, and I think you're fascinating. It's wonderful, the techniques you're doing, and it's really wonderful, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
So regarding the historical reconstructions, do you consider what kind of diet people would have had? Because how fat people are makes a big difference to the appearance of their face. So Ramesses looked quite skinny, but as a high status individual, do you consider that as well?
We try to where it's possible to do that. So the tissue depth data we use is all contemporary, or the very earliest would be 19th century. So obviously we don't have ancient Egyptian data that we can refer to, and we have to use contemporary data. But then we might choose to use the minimum set of data rather than the average if we think the diet was significantly different, which it might be. And then the status of the individual may be taken into account. In Ramesses' case, he was probably over the age of 80 when he died, and he had 120 children. So we figured he was fairly cadaverous as well at the time he died. So, but yeah, we do try to take those things into account as much as we can. But there's a lot of guesswork involved in that.
Any other question, any comments? Well, that being the case, I'm duty-bound to thank Caroline. Thank you very much indeed for an excellent presentation, very educational, very informative. In fact, you have made us feel that we all ought to go home and keep looking in the mirror and try and analyze our own selves, and God knows what result we'll come up with. I would also like to thank you for taking the time to come here and give your lecture tonight, because I know you have a lot of skulls and bodies waiting for you in Liverpool. So thank you very much indeed. Would you like to have a seat?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.